Yes. Yes, I'm a okay, so I'll say a bit to start with, but my hope is that this will generate. You have a question?
Yeah, have you got something to report?
Oh no, I haven't. I need somebody to report back on this session.
I'll do it.
Yeah? Great, thank you. So yes, I'll say a bit to start with, but by way of orientation, but I hope we shall move away from me and open it up and have discussion together. Might do a bit of pair work if the mood takes us. So, transcending a north-south divide in childhood studies through attention to political economy. So you've probably already heard me trying to interject several occasions with a what about political economy comment or a comment about class and so on. It's not because I come from that background. My training was as an anthropologist, and my first degree was in languages and culture and literature and stuff of the Middle East. It's really come about because of the focus and my interest in children and children's rights and working particularly in the Middle East, a sense that something really important was missing from the ways in which certainly the whole project of children's rights was being pursued, and also I felt in terms of the ways that childhood studies as a field was forming and the ways that people were thinking and speaking and writing and so on, that I felt was really something very, very important, which I refer to as political economy. What I felt and what I think really what I still feel is that as a field, childhood studies has paid a lot of attention to issues of what I would describe broadly as culture, so questions about identity, about recognition, something we may come back to later. And so it was very much about the whole project, in a sense. There was a very strong motivation to make children visible, to achieve that recognition for children, to understand children's lives, to talk about agency and voice and so on. And all of that's been hugely important and very much needed. But it's only part of the picture. That there is a materiality to children's lives that is extremely important. It also shapes childhoods, that shapes children's experiences, that hasn't been, to my mind, adequately addressed within the field of childhood studies, and is definitely missing from the whole project of children's rights. For reasons that are profoundly political, I believe. I'm not sure we'll get onto that. Because if I start on that, I'm waiting to shut up. So this is a quote which I think kind of encapsulates some of my concerns. So this is from the work of Neil Howard, from his doctoral research in rural Benin. And this is a quote, it was him, saying, NGOs, white people in the government come here and say that at 13 or 14 you are still a child and shouldn't work. Why do they have a different opinion to you? And then multiple respondents apparently said, because their stomachs are full. To say a little bit about the context, as I recall it, of Neil's work, so he was looking at child migration particularly from rural areas in Benin into the towns, children going to live in, possibly with extended relatives, but certainly moving into households in urban areas. A process that had a long history to it. It wasn't a new phenomenon. It was something that, a kind of circulation of children and migration as a kind of strategy for children, possibly, for economic reasons, possibly to access education and so on. Something that had a long history to it, but was now being framed within a kind of discourse of child trafficking. So part of his field work was at UNICEF headquarters, and part of it was in Benin, in villages where this was happening. And he was interested in the whole kind of ways in which UNICEF, together with government actors within Benin, was kind of the narrative they were producing about this phenomenon, and how that kind of fitted or didn't, and so on, and its impact upon families and children within a rural area where these children were, from which they were migrating. So one of the things to say about it, which I think was really, for me, was very interesting, is the areas where children particularly were migrating from, areas of cotton production. And part of the problem, problem they were experiencing economically, was because the US was subsidizing their own cotton farmers. It became very difficult. The market for cotton that they were producing kind of collapsed, the prices collapsed and so on. So poverty increased, and therefore the tendency to send your children into the city, the pressures for that also increased. So there was a kind of larger political economic force at play here that was also driving this. But none of that was picked up by government, by UNICEF and so on. This was a problem of bad culture, people being uncaring, sending their children out, trafficking them into the city and so on. And it ended up in a kind of policing and criminalization of people in the villages. So, children couldn't leave the village on their own, they had to go with an adult, and the adult had to have some kind of permit, and, a whole kind of mechanism of control built up. But nobody was actually attending to, well, actually, what's the impact of US policy on cotton, and how the market has been affected. So this larger political economic context is just not part of, let alone understanding the whole history of children and the economic and social reasons why they may have migrated. None of that was part of it. It was just framed as this kind of child rights violation, as an incidence of trafficking and so on. So to me, it kind of captures a lot of the themes and the issues and the concerns that I have in general, that whilst we must always still attend to issues of culture and be sensitive to difference and look at all those dynamics at the local level, we have to situate what's happening at the local level in a larger context, in a larger process. I feel that Sharon Stevens, some of you may know her work, who was writing in the 90s and sadly died very young. Back in '95, she wrote a piece, an introduction to her book, Children and the Politics of Culture, in which she was asking us to look at this. She was saying, look what's happening globally to children in the context of a globalising capitalism. She called it late capitalism. We probably now talk more about neoliberalism. And yet we didn't really pick that up. We didn't really actually say, well, what are the impacts, what are the expressions of neoliberalism, and what are the impacts upon children in different parts of the world. And I feel that when we start to look at that, then to some extent we dissolve this division between North and South, because these are in many ways kind of globalising, global processes that are impacting possibly in different ways, in different contexts, but the processes have some commonality. So, just very briefly, and apologies, this is horrible simplification, but just to kind of give us some terms to work with, or some understandings to work with when we're thinking about culture as opposed to political economy. This I do a lecture, or 2 lectures every year, one in Trondheim and one in Switzerland, in Fribourg, for 2 master's programs on childhood studies. And I always do a session on children and political economy. So this was produced for that. So culture, typically focusing on, when we do culture, we're focusing on values, attitudes, patterns of behaviour, how these impact on children's lives and rights. We focus on human relations and interactions. And the tendency, when we're thinking about culture, the tendency is to focus on the local and macro level context. Political economy, by contrast, focusing on the political economic forces that produce and reproduce the material conditions of children's lives. So it's looking at the material conditions, but it's saying, how are these material conditions produced? So yes, this is a child that's living in poverty, with poor access to services or whatever. But what are the forces that produce that situation, perpetuate that situation? So it's the materiality of it, but looking beyond to the forces behind that. The focus might be particularly on institutions and their workings, whether that's NGOs, governments, the World Bank, Coca-Cola Corporation, whatever. And the tendency, the focus will tend to be more on the national, the global, the macro level. So, my argument is not, let's forget that, let's just do this. It's actually, let's do this and do this. Because it's doing the two together, I profoundly believe, is what's needed within childhood studies, what's needed in terms of children's rights and addressing the many violations and forms of suffering that children are exposed to. So kind of brainstorming question, again, something I do with the students. maybe a little bit, again, a bit kind of simplistic and schematic, but hopefully just help us to orient ourselves. So why in some countries are there low rates of enrolment and participation in schooling? And I ask students to think about kind of reasons from the cultural perspective, and then reasons that we might describe as the kind of political economic reasons. Anyone care to hazard just off the top of your head? Cultural reasons, cultural obstacles, what we think of as kind of cultural obstacles, what might be termed cultural obstacles to participation, to enrolment and participation in school. Anybody?
A girl's mobility and whether girls are able to travel distances from the home to go to school.
Right. And a cultural explanation for that would be, what would be the cultural aspect?
Concerns about girls' safety tied up with notions of purity and not the opposite sex.
Okay, good. Michael,
Parents don't value school.
yeah.
And on the other side, no jobs for their kids anyway.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, but what I think is I've often seen is UNICEF and others going out and doing a big campaign to tell parents of why they should value school, without actually saying, well, maybe parents actually understand that if they keep their kids in school, there's no jobs at the end of it. Don't assume it's just because they don't understand. Maybe they understand the value better than you do in some sense. Yeah. Any others?
Maybe children dropping out of schools for reasons of violence or abuse, and then abuse or violence, in whatever that might mean, occurring because there's 100 kids in the class because there's not enough teachers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, in a way to go along with Kiraly's example of girls, no proper transport infrastructure. So, so people are exposed to whatever on the street, or it's an unsafe journey, or whatever, there's no safe transportation. Lack of teachers, poor infrastructure of the school, and all of that. So anyway, we've got the basic idea. And to labour the point, these are some of the things that students typically say, which we've already covered. So lack of appreciation for children's right to education. Perhaps people prefer other forms of education than the ones that are kind of now unfolding, the kind of standardised model. Discrimination against girls, against lower caste people, and so on. Possibly an expectation that children will work. So that's part of what's considered to be normal, appropriate, positive even, as opposed to the need. You may actually think it's not appropriate for my child. This is what I've seen with with refugees. It's not appropriate for my child to be working, but none of us, the rest of us, are allowed to work, and so the child can go under the radar and work in the informal economy. Poor quality of schooling, lack of jobs at the end of it, so it's not a worthwhile investment. But also costs, that arise due to privatisation, the whole history of structural adjustment, and blah, 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 blah. So, we could go on and on, but we get the basic point. That, if we're looking at why children do or do not go to school, we have to look in the broad, we have to take into account. And obviously these things kind of intersect, it's not clearly culture outside of whatever, you can see how they may go together. So why? What does a political economy focus add to thinking and practice? I've said around children's rights, but around children and childhood in general. So just a couple of points I wanted to suggest. First of all, I think it enhances our understanding of societal change that not accounted for by changes just in thinking, values and behaviour. So why do childhoods change is not simply the consequence of the fact that attitudes change or values change or whatever. We have to see as part of that these kind of structural changes, the changes in the economy, changes in kind of political formations and so on, the level of government. The example I wanted to give, and I take my life into my hands to do this in front of Michael and other experts on children's work. But the example I wanted to give was children's work, child labour in US factories. So as my understanding goes, and we could probably say something similar for UK, France, many other countries where children historically did work in factories. So as I understand it, amongst the important reasons why that ended, there was development of universal compulsory schooling. not just because people thought, well, wouldn't it be really lovely if children went to school and didn't work, but because at this time, particularly in a country like the UK, late 19th century, when mass schooling, compulsory schooling really rolled out, there was the perception that what we need are children to go out, to educate, basically officials to go out and work in the colonies, administrators. We need to actually educate a workforce to manage our colonies globally. So therefore it's really important. I mean, there were other reasons as well, but this was one of the reasons why it became important, was deemed important, that we should educate in a mass way across society. There were also technological advances, so you no longer needed children to be working in kind of low-tech industry where you needed lots of small hands to do things. You're starting to develop machinery that could do a lot of that work for you. So what you needed often was not lots of unskilled hands. You needed people with a reasonable level of education who could operate the machinery that was now doing that work instead of those children or whoever else. You also had, and I mentioned this morning, a unionization of labour. So this contributed to the fact that one breadwinner could often support a whole family, ensuring that wages were at an appropriate level. And yet, at the same time, clearly there were I draw on Viviana Zeller's work on pricing the priceless child, the changing attitude towards children and their place in society. So in a way, a kind of a cultural reason to go alongside, but together they were important. If you only focused and said, well, around the end of the 19th century, British society, we really changed our views on children and decided that they shouldn't go to work in factories. Well, there was a change, but it happened alongside these and other changes as well. So we can't, that wouldn't in itself help really deeply to understand. So if we contrast that with factors that contribute to the continuation of child factory work in the global south, so a lack of technological, I'm being very general. Of course there are industries, car industry, for example, in India that's now emerging. But in general, a lack of technological advance, which is not just because the technology doesn't exist, clearly it does, some places in the world, but the function of many countries in the global south, I've said it, is to service a world economy at the kind of lower end of the production chain. They don't do the sophisticated end of it. They do the much more simple things, the stitching the footballs, the piecing together pre-cut pieces of cloth to make up a garment, and so on. So it's low skill, low pay end in a production chain where the sophisticated, high pay, high skill work is reserved for US, Europe, Japan, wherever else it is. So it's, many countries are there, function in a global economy as a source of cheap labour for basic mechanical tasks. Free trade rules that prevent the growth of indigenous industry. So, for example, Toyota in Japan was able to become a global car manufacturer because they actually were able to protect their own market and prevent Ford from importing their cars or importing them with huge tariffs. That's no longer possible. The powerful players within the WTO and other institutions, US and everybody, who benefited from keeping their own economies closed off while they developed their industries, are now denying other countries from doing precisely that. So keeping them at the kind of level of low-tech industry, preventing them from developing their economies. So all of this has impact for children. So this is my point. A lack of social mobility for poor children who remain in school. Their jobs simply aren't there. There's no colonies for them to work in. The banning and constraint on trade unions often is a condition of structural adjustment, of debt or debt forgiveness. And perhaps an acceptance, an embrace even, a sense that maybe there's something positive about children working, including working in factories. So kind of again, and this is only some reasons, but again I wanted to suggest, if we look at children working in factories in Bangladesh, for example, and we see it as a cultural problem primarily, we're missing a lot. And we're certainly missing that interplay across the globe, that ends up in the phenomenon of the child factory workers in Bangladesh. There's a whole host of factors that are going on, all the way from the World Trade Organization down to that factory, that factory employees. a child or many children. So that was the first point. The second point, I think that if we don't bring this in, if we don't look at the kind of political economic dimensions, then we run the risk of othering certain populations as being strange, exotic and pathological. Because, look what they're doing. Well, on one hand, isn't it interesting and different? On the other hand, isn't it kind of problematic and kind of primitive, or something that needs to be changed and addressed, depending on your point of view? The first probably would be the more the childhood studies response, so isn't it interesting and different and exotic? And the other would be more the child rights response, so isn't it deeply problematic, or shouldn't we try to change it? But if we don't, if we see this as a cultural problem, then that's what we end up with. If we actually see that, that child is working in that factory in Bangladesh, not simply or necessarily even because his or her family think it's appropriate, but because look at the whole system and the way it's stacked, look what the opportunities are that exist, look at the role of Bangladesh in the world economy, look at what it means to try and achieve social mobility within a country like Bangladesh if you're from a poor neighborhood or whatever. All of that needs to be brought in if we're to get beyond this kind of radical othering, where we see the other as different, exotic, and possibly deeply problematic. I didn't want to turn it into a lecture. I am going to move on and open it up, but please do ask or comment or whatever as we go along, or express profound outrage. So one of the things that we, I think, are increasingly aware of is how inequality is growing massively. It's now, as I understand it, even more of an issue within many countries than between countries. So, for much of, I guess, the last century or two, or maybe longer, the big issue was this huge gap between the wealthy nations and the poor nations. Now, of course, many countries are middle income, and what's become more of the issue is this gap between the rich and the poor within countries. This is where the greatest inequalities are emerging. So inequality is a product of political economic forces to a very great extent, which has very important consequences for children. So in terms of life, survival, development, it undermines efforts to ensure basic health care for mothers and children. There's work that's been done to show, to connect up inequality and the rate of under 5 mortality, for example. Countries with very high rates of inequality, such as South Africa, also the US in a kind of global north context, have rates of infant mortality, under 5 mortality that are much higher than many countries with much lower level of inequality. In a quite systematic way, this has been demonstrated. Protection, inequality increases exposure to social and health problems, including crime, drugs, etc. The work of Pickett and Wilkinson, the Spirit Level book, which came out around 2010, again, systematically, only countries, OECD countries, unfortunately, that they have the data for, but it shows quite systematically that countries with high levels of inequality, you consistently see much greater incidence of a whole basket of social problems, many of which profoundly and directly affect children, including bullying and drug abuse and suicide, I think, is part of that. Many different social and health problems. And also there's a connection between inequality and discrimination. So, entrenched inequality constrains social mobility, reinforces that inequality, that discrimination, and so on. So this kind of circular relationship, vicious circle between discrimination and inequality. This was Wilkinson and Pickett. So, I've only got 4 countries there. It hasn't reproduced it anyway. You can see USA. This is income inequality and this is I think, using the Gini coefficient, and this is what they produce as this index of health and social problems, putting together all these different social issues like bullying and violence and drug abuse and alcoholism and so on. And there was a very, US as being the most unequal and having the highest incidence of those problems. Their book also uses data taking all of the states of the United States, and again the same line appears. The more unequal the economy within that state, the higher the incidence of these particular basket of problems. So that's just one more bit to throw in the pot before we have a discussion. One way of thinking about this, in a way that this move towards the cultural and bringing alongside it a move towards something that's more about the material and the political economic, is perhaps to think of it in terms of recognition and redistribution. Nancy Fraser is somebody that's talked and written quite a lot about this. So recognition, the politics of recognition, if you like, relates to things such as addressing the trends that govern inclusion and exclusion of particular groups. In this case, we could think of children, subsections of the population. It's about acknowledging, accepting diversity, for example, on the basis of colour, sexuality, gender, whatever. Cultural and attitudinal change. So I would argue that childhood studies has been very much doing the politics of recognition, which is fine, which is important. What it hasn't been doing, or has been doing much, much less, is the politics of redistribution, which is about the trends that govern distribution of resources, how government money is spent, how is taxation used, who benefits, who loses out, what are the consequences for children. It's about an acceptance of the need for equality of treatment and opportunity. So it's about addressing issues of social mobility, looking at both in a kind of systematic, structural way. It's about changing political economic processes. So, it could be about making a connection, showing how large corporations are influencing or seeking to influence governments to develop policy which is not in the interests of children. We can see this happening very clearly, I think, in many countries where the food and drinks lobby, for example, the pharmaceutical lobby, energy lobby, and so on, influencing governments to either quell, reduce policy or make policy softer, more in their interests, but not in the interests of children. So it's about making those links as well, looking at political processes. So recognition of children-focused development, so recognition of children as rights holders, the obstacle to such recognition being seen as primarily cultural and attitudinal. The focus of action often becomes about awareness raising. So feeding into increasing awareness, trying to get people to think differently. Redistribution, so it's considering children not only in terms of their situation as children, but also in terms of patterns of distribution, which could be, it's about that intersectionality between being a child and being of a particular class or caste, gender, ethnicity, and so on. Seeing disability, seeing those intersectionalities and what the consequences are for children in terms of their access to resources, the material consequences of being a child, but not just a child, but a child from a particular class background or a child whose childhood is influenced by these other factors as well. And I think this is something I really kind of struggle with, particularly the class. It just became so outre, vulgar almost, for many years to talk about class, I think, in academia, in many fields. It was almost, particularly the sort of, the 90s in particular, and the early 2000s. I think it's coming back now. I see more of it, partly perhaps because of this perception of inequality. But I really think we have barely begun to think about how class and childhood intersect. And that's a major, major gap. So the redistribution, the actions, it's about looking at taxation, including tax avoidance. This is my current obsession, tax avoidance, because it's absolutely massive and means that governments are starved of billions that could be spent differently, that could be available. At a time when so many countries are experiencing austerity and services are being stripped back and stripped back and stripped back, and the citizens are being asked to pay for not only just to pay for the mistakes of the financial crisis, but also to cover the tax that's now being increasingly held back from governments by large corporations. The same large corporations that fund organisations like UNICEF and Save the Children. Yeah. So instead of paying money to the government to be used for everybody, including for international development potentially, is being withheld, but is being given as charity, as a gift, as corporate social responsibility to organisations like UNICEF and Save the Children, which gives them a whole lot more PR than if they just paid their taxes, but means that those organisations are now being directed to do certain work that the corporates want to do, not to do other sorts of work they don't want them to do. Classic example. So Coca-Cola give money to Save the Children in the US, and Save the Children pull out of, within a matter of weeks, pull out of a campaign to get a tax on fizzy drinks in the US. Pull out of that and say that's not really the work we do as an organisation. But of course it's not now, because you've got 5 million from Coca-Cola. So that's not the work you do anymore. What does that mean if you wanted to do as an organisation, and as I think we all should be doing much more, to look at childhood obesity and how that's spreading across the globe, not just in the US or Europe, but massively in many other countries as well. What do you do to Save the Children? You've taken money from Coca-Cola. You're not going to become a big advocate around control on marketing, about kind of regulations, putting taxes on fizzy drinks, all of that. So, regulation of wages, national budgets, international debt, trade policy, minimum wages, unionisation. All of these, I would suggest, have huge consequences for children and children's lives, for the realisation of their rights, just simply for their everyday lives and the nature of those lives, what their everyday experiences are. But we don't make those connections. We don't situate children's experience, children's everyday lives in relation to these kinds of forces, and I think we should. I think it's vital that we do. So, I thought we could start by, maybe we could do this in 2s or 3s to get it going, just to think about how issues around class, distribution, political economy, whichever you feel most comfortable working with, how are they present in your work? How might they be present in your work? Maybe it's not something you've necessarily focused on deliberately and consciously, but what's there behind that you might actually interrogate? How might you situate that particular issue, that particular context in terms of issues of class or distribution or political economy? What might be the benefits to your work of including, or if you already include, enhancing the focus on political economy in your work? But what might be the constraints in doing that? What might be difficult for you to do in terms of bringing more of that focus into your work? What might constrain you from doing that? Is that clear? So let's